I used to go to the gym near my work to unwind after a long shift and burn off the stress of the day. The 24-hour access was ideal since at the time I worked second shift at the hospital and I could work out free of peak hour crowds. Most nights I had the place to myself with just the sounds of my feet on the treadmill and the music from my headphones. But one night, everything changed. As I swiped my card and entered the gym, I noticed a guy sitting behind the weight rack. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting there, drinking water and scrolling on his phone. It wasn't the strangest thing, everyone takes breaks between reps, but this guy was just leaned back like he was just hanging out. It struck me as odd because most people were in and out focused on the routines, but this guy, he just sat there. I changed into my workout clothes in the locker room, hoping he'd gone by the time I went back out, but he was still there, now facing the line of treadmills. I tried to ignore him while I prepped my water and towel at the treadmill, brushing off the awkwardness of the moment. I told myself he was probably just taking a break, or maybe he was waiting for someone. Still, as I hopped on the treadmill and started my run, I could feel him watching me. Something was definitely off. The mirrors in front of the treadmills gave me a clear view of the whole room, and every now and then, when I glanced up, I caught him watching me. His eyes would meet mine in that reflection, only for him to quickly look back at his phone. The first time, I thought it was a coincidence, but then it happened again and again, each time confirming the unnerving feeling that something was going to happen. I forced myself to focus on my run, trying to drown out the growing anxiety with the rhythm of my footsteps and the pounding music in my ears. I really hoped he would leave, but he didn't. I usually ran for an hour, but at just over a half hour, I stopped. It was just too uncomfortable, plus I didn't want to get exhausted with this guy around. Something told me to keep some energy in the tank that night, and I'm glad I did. My shirt and ponytail clung to me with sweat, and all I wanted was to grab my bag and get out of there. The guy was still sitting in the same spot, but now he was staring at the floor, occasionally glancing in my direction. I wasn't about to change in the locker room, not with him hanging around. I grabbed my towel and water bottle and without making eye contact, walked past the weights to get to the women's locker room, and I felt him tense up. I tried to look as calm as possible, but as soon as I was inside, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The locker room was quiet. The faint buzz of the overhead lights was the only sound. I quickly splashed some cold water on my face to help my nerves recover. That's when I heard it. The soft creak of the locker room door opening. My heart jumped. My hand frozen mid-air, water still dripping from my fingers. I slowly turned toward the sound, my blood running cold. There he was, standing in the doorway. I stared at him, trying to keep my breathing steady. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. He was blocking the exit, and I was cornered. "Hey, you dropped something," he said, stepping inside, the door closing behind him, but his arm still blocked the entrance. He held his hand out towards me, his fingers wrapped around a small object, but I couldn't tell what it was. I didn't care. I didn't drop anything. "No, I didn't," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper, my throat tight with fear. He smirked, taking another step closer. "You sure about that?" Instinctively, I backed up, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything to get out of this situation. That's when I noticed the light switch on the wall beside me. It was a gamble, but I didn't see any other options. As calmly as I could, I stepped sideways towards the switch, keeping my eyes on him, hoping he wouldn't notice what I was doing. "You need to get out of here," I I said, trying to sound firm, but we both heard the shake in my voice. Why would I do that? His smirk widened and he took another step forward. My hand found the wall and I slashed at the switch, flicking it off, plunging the room into darkness. What the hell? He cursed, the sudden darkness throwing him off. I didn't wait. I dropped to the floor, crawling towards him to reach the sinks again. Moving as silently as I could, I heard him stumbling around, cursing as he tried to find me in the dark. You think you're so smart? He screamed, his voice echoing farther into the locker room as I reached the sinks. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. I kept crawling from the sinks towards the door, the only light in the room now coming from the thin strip under the door. I had to reach the door before his eyes adjusted. I could hear him knocking into lockers, getting more furious as he struggled to find me. Finally, I reached the door and carefully stood up, sliding against the wall to reach for the handle. But just as I was about to open it, I heard him coming up behind me. I yanked the door open, the sudden flood of light momentarily blinding both of us. I saw his shadow lunging towards me, but I ducked out of the way, slipping through the door and slamming it behind me. I didn't stop. I sprinted down the hallway, not daring to look back, my only thought being to get out of there as fast as possible. As I reached the gym's main entrance, I heard the locker room door burst open behind me, his cursing echoing in the empty space. I burst through the front doors, not stopping until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly, it took me a few tries to get the key in the ignition. I could see him standing at the glass doors, watching me, but he didn't follow me out. I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as I sped out of the parking lot, not daring to look in the rearview mirror until I was far down the road. It wasn't until I was halfway home that the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving me shaking and on the verge of tears. I couldn't believe what had just happened. The reality of how much danger I had been in. I didn't even want to think about what could have happened. I learned later that the gym's security cameras weren't functioning, so there was no evidence of him being in the gym. Worse still, my swipe into the building was the only one registered during the time of the incident, so how he had gotten in is still a mystery. I'll never forget how that guy had just been waiting, watching for the right moment. I'm strong and fit, but what if someone else had been there alone with him that night? Someone who was a little slower. I fly to Seattle from Los Angeles for work pretty regularly, and use the quick 4-hour flight to review my presentations and make sure I'm ready for the meetings ahead. But on one particular flight, after feeling fortunate to have scored a window seat, which I preferred, the feeling didn't last long. As I settled in, a guy sat next to me in the crowded flight, and I immediately sensed something was off with him. I smiled politely at him when he sat, taking in that he was in his mid-40s, his hair was slicked down to his head, and he was wearing a wrinkled, oversized jacket. As I tried to focus on my tablet, I began to notice the unsettling way he kept turning to me, with his lips moving like he was talking to himself. But in trying harder to ignore it, I kept focusing on him, staying aware of him from the corner of my eye. As he shifted in his seat, I told myself, everyone has their quirks, and maybe he was just nervous about flying. As the plane taxied down the runway, the man leaned towards me and asked, "Do you ever wonder how many people die up here, in planes?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, and if he hadn't leaned towards me, I would have thought he was still talking to himself. I forced an awkward smile, unsure of what to say, and shook my head, hoping he'd just leave me alone. He was quiet for a while as the flight progressed, but the question grated on me, and I kept going over it in my head. He kept shifting in his seat, occasionally muttering to himself. I couldn't make out all the words, and there were times I thought he was arguing to himself. Every now and then, I'd catch him staring at me, his eyes glassy, like he was looking right through me. About halfway through the flight, I gave up on my presentation because I just couldn't concentrate, and part of me didn't want this guy to see anything, like my company name or my contact info. I tried to distract myself with a movie and put the headphones in, hoping he would take the hint and leave me alone. But I could still feel him watching me, which made my skin crawl. I noticed his movements get bigger, and he finally leaned in closer and whispered, "I bet you taste like salt and copper." My stomach dropped. I shook my head and pressed myself as close to the window as I could, panic beginning to bubble up inside me. He was so close, and the armrest between us suddenly felt like no barrier at all. I wanted to get up, to switch seats, to do anything to get away from this man, but the seatbelt sign was on and the flight attendants were nowhere in sight. Plus, I'd have to press past him to get out of the seat. A few moments later, the plane hit a patch of turbulence as we began our descent into Seattle, and the cabin lights flickered. All I wanted to do was get off that plane. I gripped the bottom of my seat, my knuckles white as the plane shuddered and dipped. The man beside me seemed completely unfazed by the turbulence, smiling, his focus entirely on me. When I didn't think the turbulence shaking and jolting could get any worse, the guy leaned in even closer, his lips brushing my ear. "Since I saw you at the gate, I've been wondering how you'd look and smell while decomposing." I wanted to throw up. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I fought the urge to scream. I was trapped, horrified at the thought of climbing over him with the plane shaking so hard. I thought it might go down, and these were my last moments here beside this horrible man. I chose to stay still, pretending I hadn't heard him, but I was shaking. When I felt his breath on my neck, I thought he was going to say it again, assuming I hadn't heard him, but he started sniffing me. The sound of it was nauseating, like a predator sampling the scent of his prey. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the plane to land, to end this nightmare. Every second felt like an eternity. I was acutely aware of every breath he took, every rustle of his clothing, and I prayed that I wouldn't have to hear him speak again. The plane jolted as it touched down, and as soon as the seatbelt sign turned off, I unbuckled myself and stood up, shoving him away as I lunged towards the aisle. I grabbed my bag from the overhead bin with trembling hands and bolted down the aisle, desperate to get off that plane. Politeness be damned, I had to get away from that guy. As I stepped into the jet bridge, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I kept moving, weaving through the crowd, not daring to slow down until I was out of the terminal and into the bustling safety of the airport. I never saw him again, and I didn't report it. Even though I know I'm safe, a part of me will never forget being trapped next to that horrible guy, unable to escape as he slowly and deliberately terrorized me. As a realtor, I've seen my fair share of old houses, some charming, some run down, but all with their quirks. But nothing prepared me for what I encountered that day. It was late in the afternoon when I arrived at the property, an old Victorian on the outskirts of town. The house had been on the market for months with little interest because it needed restoration, but a potential buyer finally showed some curiosity. I thought this would be just another routine showing, and I was eager to get the house ready, hoping I could close the sale before the first snowfall, which would make the old, unheated house much harder to sell. The house stood silently on a quiet side residential road, its tall, narrow windows staring out like empty eyes. The paint was peeling, and the porch creaked under my feet as I approached the front door. This was the first time I was showing this particular house, and I only knew the layout by the pictures in the listing. I held my breath as I pulled out the key, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The air inside was thick with the scent of dust and neglect. I flicked on the lights, and the old bulbs flickered hesitantly before casting a dim glow over the faded wallpaper and worn wooded floors. As I moved from room to room, I mentally noted the places that needed touching up: the sagging ceiling in the dining room, the chipped tiles in the kitchen. I remember laughing to myself that this house would be perfect for a horror movie set. Tidying up as best as I could, I checked my watch. The buyer was due in about 15 minutes. I was about to head back to the front door when I heard it. A faint, scratching sound from above me. I froze, my brain second-guessing what I'd just heard. It wasn't a metallic sound like old pipes or the groan of settling wood. It was something more deliberate. When it came again, scratching like claws or nails against wood, followed by a soft thump, almost like something heavy being dragged, I knew I hadn't imagined it. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some other animal that had gotten in through a broken window, but I had goosebumps all the same. I couldn't leave it uninvestigated, not with a potential buyer on the way. With my heart in my throat, I made my way to the staircase. The wooden steps creaked underfoot as I climbed, the sound of my breath loud in the silence. I hoped that whatever it was would hear me coming and make its way outside again before the client arrived. But the scratching grew louder as I reached the second floor, the sound coming from a room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and as I approached, the air grew colder, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. I rationalized that there was an open window allowing the fall air to creep in. I hesitated outside the door, every instinct screaming for me to leave, to run. But I couldn't ignore the sound. I had to see what was in there. With trembling hands, I slowly pushed the door open. The room was dim, lit only by the fading daylight filtering through a grimy window. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just an empty, dust-covered space. But then, my eyes were drawn to the far corner, and I felt the air catch in my throat. There, on her hands and knees, was a woman. She wore a tattered, dark dress, and her long, black hair hung over her face, hiding her features. She was barefoot, her knees bloodied and raw, as if she'd been doing this for a long time. She moved with an unnatural speed, crawling back and forth along the wall like some kind of deranged animal, her hands and knees making that awful scratching sound on the worn, ragged floorboards. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I was paralyzed, unable to think or move. All I could do was watch in horror as she continued her frantic, repetitive movement, completely unaware of my presence. Finally, something snapped inside me, and I managed to step back. I closed the door as quietly as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the doorknob. Then I turned and ran, my steps on the stairs surely alerting the woman to my presence. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath as I fumbled for my phone to call the police from my car. When they arrived, I was still inside my car, watching the house with wide, terrified eyes. I told them everything, my voice trembling as I described the woman in the house, the blood, the awful scratching. They looked at each other, clearly skeptical of my story, but they entered the house anyway. They searched room by room while I waited outside, praying they would find something, anything, to prove that I wasn't losing my mind. But when they came back out, they told me there was nothing. No sign of anyone living there, no blood on the floor, no trace of any woman at all. They told me it was just an empty old house, and my imagination was probably just playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw. The image of that woman, her horrible crawling, the blood, it was burned into my mind, and I knew I would never forget it. As I left the property that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still in there, something that didn't want to be disturbed. I never went back to that house, and I never heard of anyone else trying to sell it, even though the for sale sign is still up. The prospective buyer never showed up, and I didn't bother to follow up. Whatever was in that house, it was something I wanted to leave far behind. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that scratching sound in my dreams, and I wake up in a cold sweat, praying I'll never hear it again in the waking world. If you like these stories, this is the place for you. I cover scary stories about ghosts, cryptids, paranormal events, and disturbing, creepy human encounters. My Etsy store is open if you'd like to support me there. The link's in the description. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.